Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Hoffman, the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UC Berkeley. And for the next hour, we have the honor of being able to hear from Professor Dan Kammen from UC Berkeley. The name of his talk is the Clean Energy Transition and COP26, which he'll explain to you. A few words about Dan. He's the director of Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, a professor in both Energy and Resources Group and in the Goldman School of Public Policy. He has been working at the state and the national and global levels, and we're really excited to have him back with us for the next hour. He has asked that questions can be put into the chat. He will continue to look at those and maybe answer some of those relevant questions in the sections of his talk, but he will also devote the last 15 minutes to your questions. So thank you for joining us. And here is Professor Dan Kammen.
Susan, thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks to OLLI for hosting me. And I see some familiar names on here, some people who have been supporters of my laboratory. I see several people whose pictures are of their dogs, hummingbirds. I appreciate that. My dog is snoozing or sort of impatiently sitting next to me. So I'm really pleased to be back at OLLI, and I want to thank you all for taking time out of your Friday mornings. I recognize that the title of this talk may not be the most exciting. After all, what is COP? Who cares about COP? So I'll try to weave together a mixture of what is happening in the clean energy space, what's happening in the dirty energy space. Today's debates on Capitol Hill are particularly important, and in particular, where is the US and where's the global community in COP26, which is the conference of the parties to the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'll get into that in a second, but I'm gonna start sharing my screen. I'm gonna also do my best to monitor the chat as we go. And that's, sorry, something is funny in my preferences. I apologize. For some reason, it's not letting me show my slides to you. That's a little bit interesting. This is on me. I probably should have checked this ahead of time. Looks like I have some weird updates. So give me 1 second to try to get this working. I have to admit, I'm a little puzzled. I have to open system preferences and do something I've never had to do before. Let me see what's not working right as I try to set this up. Again, my apologies. I might have to switch machines. I'm not sure why it's not liking me today. I am going to switch machines. So I apologize to everybody. This is a bad way to start a talk. I'm going to jump to a different computer that I know will work for this.
All right, Dan. And when you do, would you also close the door to your
I will absolutely do that, but I'm just going to jump onto a different one.
Okay.
I have no idea why it's, I wonder if this is a new security thing at Berkeley that I didn't track something properly. It's really odd. I'm just going to jump into the session. I will close this one. My apologies to everybody. I do have screen share privileges. Oh, it's going to make me re-register.
And you know, Dan, these kinds of things have been happening for the last 2 weeks. I don't know if there are, these updates are university required or Zoom required. But they have been.
I really apologize. I have never seen this before where it's saying it doesn't recognize my, doesn't recognize PowerPoint on the system. And this is a Berkeley-wide thing. So I apologize. Let me see if I can launch this. And then I will close out the one on my other computer so that I'm not echoing, talking to you twice. Let's see if this looks okay to everybody.
And so as we're waiting
Let's hope
for,
I'm back and you can see me.
we cannot see you just yet.
Oh, really?
Here, we can see you.
Okay, so I really apologize to everybody. This is the worst possible way to start a talk. Talk about downscaling yourself. All right, I'm going to jump in as I thought I was doing 4 minutes ago. And afterwards, not at your expense, I'll try to figure out, am I hitting some yet another new security blanket that is not helpful. So sharing screen, jumping into my slides. Good thing I have 2 computers handy, which is normally I think it's a little bit excessive, but this way it seems to be useful. And just let me know if you cannot see the slides now. You should be able to see everything, and let's start up. And so, like I said, I am going to monitor the chat. Shut the office door. Give me 1 second. Okay. Talk about Bitcoins and excessive power. I will try to weave that in. That is definitely an interesting point. We'll come to it. So like I said, I will keep looking at the chat to see things that are going on. And as you heard in the introduction, I have a couple different hats at Berkeley campus. I'm the chair of this thing called the Energy and Resources Group, founded to work on these issues in the 70s, also in our school policy. And I'm in the Department of Nuclear Engineering, which has gone through a remarkable transformation, not our department, but the field of nuclear energy in the last little bit. So there's a lot brewing that we'll talk about. But the context I really want to focus on is what is taking place around the international climate conversation. Obviously, this US administration is dramatically different than the previous one in its engagement on climate issues domestically and internationally. And for anybody that wants more on this topic, the website of my laboratory is here on top. It's RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, so RAIL Berkeley EDU. And then we do tweet under my name, usually 1 tweet a day or so, unless it's a really busy day, like during the climate conference that will take place first 2 weeks of November in Glasgow, Scotland. I will be there. I've actually been to 13 of the last 15 COPs. And so it's been a pretty standard part of my beat, both in my academic role, but also when I was the Science Envoy working with Secretary of State John Kerry. In terms of the kind of projects and work that I do in my own laboratory, this is kind of just a snapshot of some of the PhD graduates from my program. Upper left, Rick Duke was the special advisor to President Barack Obama on climate. Right below him, Rebecca Shirley runs the Energy Innovation and Justice Program at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. She runs it from their newest office in Nairobi, Kenya. Majida Zati in the bottom center is the Chief Air Quality Officer for the City of London, as well as being a professor from Imperial College. Nikki Avila runs distributed microgrid energy systems for our utility, Pacific Gas and Electric. It's just a really interesting group. Ryan Shelby, right in the middle, runs the Energy Engagement Program for U.S. Agency for International Development out of the Johannesburg, South Africa office. So I'm really talking about a lot of the work that this remarkable group of students in my lab has done. And as we think about the climate story, this is a picture that if I had seen this 10 years ago, even knowing everything I do about climate science, I think I literally would have said this is some painting. But in fact, this is a picture taken over Lake Tahoe, which truly looks like, to me, something out of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome or something else. It's not a world that I could have conceived of emotionally when I moved back to California 22 years ago. It is the world that we're in, and there's multiple features of it. And I will get to that climate emergency that no one who has eyes can say we're not in right now. But to think about the climate negotiations and the climate dynamics, I really want to go back and do an introduction to this fateful moment in 2014. This was the famous handshake between President Obama and President Xi. at the APEC summit. And this was an event where the US and China agreed to one of the most unusual political agreements that most of my sort of political science colleagues have. And yes, Michael, nuclear is in the picture, although Diablo Canyon is closing. We'll come to that one a little bit later on. But the deal that Obama and Xi struck was that the US would cut their emissions by 1/3 by 2025, and that China would peak their emissions by 2030. And if it doesn't sound right because it's different things in different years, it's a so-called asynchronous treaty, you're absolutely right. And people were kind of baffled by what was in the mix. The reason why they came up with this agreement was because the climate meetings to that point had not produced significant change in the standard kind of United Nations back and forth negotiations where everybody had a vote. Europe thought they were way ahead of everybody else. China, United States seemed to be at the back of the pack. That world has turned around. President Obama was not able to get his climate plan through, but interesting and ironically, there is a real change in the energy landscape, not just under President Biden that I'll highlight, but even under President Trump, we saw US's emissions start to fall and actually fall dramatically. And how much of that was due to structural change? How much of that was due to the rollback in energy use and hence emissions during COVID? There's multiple perspectives on it, but the US did not meet its goal. It hasn't met it yet. It's 2025 goal, but it's not been on target until now. Meanwhile, China is very much on they are on pace to meet their pledge of peaking their emissions by 2030. And I'll show a graph of that in a bit, but it really highlights the story. And I had a really wonderful opportunity under President Obama. I was asked to play this role of Science Envoy. Picture on the left, there I am with Secretary Kerry in what I guess we can only call a mantle. But working in this role of Science Envoy, which is essentially an ambassador for climate issues. President Obama and I met a number of times on it at a variety of sessions. And the picture on the right is part of my beat that was to work on climate partnerships in Africa. There with US Ambassador to Morocco at the time, Dwight Bush. And so I kind of feel like I have at least some level of both the science and the policy perspective on what went on. I served 2016, 2017 for President Obama. My term outlived his term in office a little bit. So we need to start with what is the US position domestically, because essentially what all countries put forward as their international position on climate stems strongly from their domestic ones. As candidate, then Vice President Biden set a plan to achieve 100% clean energy in the United States by 2035. So I want to highlight that. Less than 15 years from now, the US, under the Biden plan, will have a fully clean energy sector. It's the big source of emissions in the United States. It's a remarkable thing to put on the table. You can be skeptical because obviously this would happen after his term or terms, depending what happens, ends. But he did something that made that remarkably bold statement even more bold. He borrowed directly from California's climate policy and said that of the money that they're negotiating today on Capitol Hill, the $1.3 trillion in the infrastructure package, and the $3 trillion in the larger, more contested, even within the Democratic Party, the left and right are battling. But the Biden plan, called Justice 40, is that 40% of those funds will be spent on disadvantaged and minority fence line underserved communities. And that is directly borrowing from California's own version that calls for 35% of all of our cap and trade, our climate budget, to be spent on underserved communities. And since we've underinvested in them for decades, this is a wonderful rebalancing. So that is a big, bold plan that almost every analysis says will generate more jobs than are lost in the fossil fuel sector. It has money for transitions for workers in those areas. It does a whole number of things for which I am personally an unabashed just fanboy of how exciting that mixture of things is. And that's not all that's in the Biden plan. That $2 trillion federal investments they want to see directly in energy is expected to catalyze perhaps another $3 trillion in private sector money. We have some really good examples of that strategy working both in California, where we used to always lead the federal government in our plans on the climate side. California now trails the federal government in the sense that our go green date in California is 2045. Now we're 10 years behind the Biden plan by many measures. And that doesn't happen very often. But also President Biden has announced both a domestic former US EPA lead Gina McCarthy and an international former Secretary of State, my former boss, John Kerry, as the international climate czars. And they are busy at work working with states, working with other governments. In the last month, Secretary Kerry has been to China twice. He's heading to Mexico in a matter of days. He's been to summits on this. He's brought a remarkable team together so that there are literally highest level government offices reporting directly to the president of the National Security Council, money to really jump in on this. And to Tom's question, can one promise high quality paying jobs, for example, in West Virginia? Senator Manchin's high profile role at the time? The answer is yes. Something that was in that Obama plan back in 2014 that has been baked into the current one is a multi-billion-dollar retraining and or pensioning fund, depending on what individual workers want. Governor of West Virginia, one of my former grad students who ran for Congress in West Virginia, have all worked very hard on programs that are not just there, they're also in other areas, in Wyoming and other places that are really investing strongly in working for clean energy. And yes, all administrations are not consistent. As Marilee highlights, the Enbridge Line 3 has been opposed at one level by the president, but is weaving its way through. And if and when that opens, it would bring some of the dirtiest fuels, Canadian tar sands, into the US in direct contravention of what we're talking about. So are administrations entirely lined up and consistent? Certainly not. The other thing that President Biden did in his first day in office, in his third executive order, was to rejoin this Paris Climate Conference. And so the meeting coming up, COP26, is one that we will be back at the table in a very big way. And for those of you who watched the announcements at the opening of the United Nations last week, I would say the country that did the largest single COP relevant announcement, conference of the parties, was China, that announced that they were going to end international funding for coal projects, so-called greening their Belt and Road International Initiative. And by most estimates, that announcement by President Xi last week destroyed up to $50 billion of value in potential coal projects. Will have a huge impact on Southeast Asia, on Africa, where there's now a direct need to finance green energy projects instead of coal. And I am personally waiting to see what is the equally big picture thing that the US does in this area. And so there are interesting and really important pre-COP announcements already happening. We are on October 1st today, and the COP meeting starts in exactly 1 month from today, November 1st. We'll all be in Glasgow or online, depending how one is attending these negotiations. And so the kind of position for what we think about, this is probably the graph I use most commonly in my talks. You don't need to know anything about the numbers, but on the left, that's billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And the path that we were on in 2014 is the red one, that would warm the planet overall by about 4.5 degrees Celsius. That means more than 20 degrees Celsius at the poles. And Marilee is right. You did hear that things like line 3 went online, but it's not fully connected to all of the dirtiest sources of fuel in Canada. It is bringing in some existing so-called sweeter or less dirty, but still dirty fossil fuels. But Canada wants to open this up, and this would contravene both the US and the Canadian national positions. And this is why this graph is so critical, because if we plot these nice pathways, but then we go ahead and do things like that, we are making it impossible to meet the goal. The first goal negotiated for the Paris Climate Agreement 2015, if every country did do what they said, it would have cut out all of the red. The bad news is that the only countries that have been certified to be on that path are 2, and they're not the ones that you most hear of. You hear about great climate advances going on in Denmark and Germany and maybe some others, but the only 2 countries that are actually on pace to do what they've said for the Paris Climate Agreement are 2 African countries, the Gambia and Morocco. And I suspect that most people wouldn't have got that right. I know you guys read a lot and maybe you would have, but my students certainly don't get that right when I talk about it. So that's the red is if we do what we said, we'd cut off a degree of warming. Our goal then was 2 degrees, limiting warming to 2 degrees. And that leaves all the gray area here, needed new innovations, new technologies. We talked about what solar might do. Is there a future for nuclear? California is talking about phasing out the use of hydro for energy to preserve rivers, to bring back salmon, to give back in many ways. So there's a really interesting landscape of things going on. And I'm glad that Stephen Colbert is up on the Gambia. It's a key place. It's a very small country, but it is a hydropowered country. And so we still need to innovate to invest new money, which is why the debate going on in DC today is so critical. And since this announcement went on back in 2015 that we needed to limit warming to 2 degrees, the international group, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of which I'm a part, which shared the 2000 Nobel Peace Prize, has lowered that limit to 1.5 degrees. Making it more stringent when we're not acting as tough. And it's even tougher because we've already warmed the planet by 1.3 degrees. So the headroom left, 0.2 degrees, is a snap of the emissions, a massive forest fire in Siberia. I mean, we could jump over that in a second. But in this overly busy slide, I kind of highlight what's the difference in terms of extreme heat, how quickly we'll be ice free in the Arctic, damaged ecosystems of that original 2 degree target versus what would happen if we can really clamp down, follow that Biden plan of zeroing out carbon from the energy sector, biggest source of emissions in the United States, by 2035. You can see sector by sector, there's differences, but it's kind of 2 to 10 times worse in terms of what would be the climate and the racial and the ecological and the food systems damages difference if we can really aim for that 1.5. I personally believe the 1.5 target is still viable. I have colleagues who do not, but I think it is possible to get there if we were to essentially do the kinds of things that California has on paper. We too need to put our money where our mouth is. And now that we're post-recall election, Governor Newsom has committed to this level. And now I think one of the jobs here is to really implement many of those kinds of changes. I'm not going to go through the California story in detail. I just want to put our numbers in context because it's so important in terms of both how we will affect our own energy mix and also how successful we've been. So California's original plan was to be 20% powered by renewable energy by 2010. We missed that target. Our target for 2020 was 33%. We overmade it. We were in the low 40s. 40% in 2020. So we missed 2010. We got beyond our goal for 2020, and our goal for 2030 used to be 50%. But in fact, our goal for 2030 is now 60% because we passed a subsequent bill, Senate Bill 100 for 100% clean energy by 2045. We are doing well on that target. I won't go through the detailed numbers, but I will jump to some of the interesting things. California has said we are going to end the sale of new gas-powered vehicles by 2035. And since we made that announcement back in September, Massachusetts and the United Kingdom have each said they are going to have 2030 as the date to no longer permit the sale of new gas-powered or diesel-powered vehicles. In terms of what all this means, California has done things like announcing that every new home built after 2020 must generate as much energy as it consumes. And here's a picture of a housing development opened after that date. You can see the single family home, the yellow one down in the bottom right. You can see these multifamily homes here in kind of the middle of the picture, all built with enough solar, some with energy storage, some without, to meet this goal of homes themselves generate as much energy as they need. That is great. That is a way to get deployment out there. But you'll also notice that this requires home ownership. And home ownership is something which is difficult in California. It is something where if you look at the racial profile and the socioeconomic of who owns their home versus rents, there are some clear economic disparities, hence that Justice 40 kind of target. So one of the things being worked on in the California legislature are rules to permit group deployment of solar, for example, on the top of grocery stores. And that solar would be available for you to buy into as a condominium owner, or it would be a required portion of a rental property so that we can green structures of all kinds of different sorts. As we think about those goals, 60% clean energy in 2030, I actually think California can go much further, and I'm not saying anything bold. In April of this year, California, the world's fifth largest economy, hit 95% powered by renewable energy. Now, that was one day, happened to be a Sunday. It wasn't a high demand day. But when you talk about a place as big as California, that's pretty remarkable. And when you look at the numbers behind this, it's maybe even more exciting. So this graph at the right shows the amount of different energy sources in the mix on that interesting, fateful day. And by the way, we've hit this several times since. It wasn't just one Sunday. Then following Sunday, we were 93% powered by renewables. It is a pretty impressive numbers. Well, you'll notice renewables in green, they shoot up during the day when solar is out. And as a result, the amount of natural gas that was burned in state and in the out-of-state natural gas plants that feed us electricity dropped during the day because when renewables were so high. You'll notice that the amount of hydropower went to basically zero. We stopped using the power from our dams, from Hetch Hetchy, et cetera. And interestingly enough, with this clean energy in the mix, California became a net energy exporter during those days. So there are remarkable stories. We have a great climate. We have a nice set of climate policies. California was able to make it happen. If we can do 95% clean energy in 2021, I actually do not think getting to 100% clean energy, which will mean renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, offshore wind energy, tidal power, a variety of things. I don't think it's going to be as hard as almost anyone thinks to get to these clean energy economy by not 2045, not 2035, but by 2030. The red line is the amount of imports California was buying. You can see we bought some imports in the early morning and at night, but during the day we were exporting solar panels, solar power to our neighboring states. So this is a remarkable picture of being able to get it done. California, as no one here will be surprised, does a lot of things wrong. We're trailing on environmental justice, but as a clean energy leader, we are up there. It's an interesting mix. And the lessons from California are making a difference. This is President Biden's summit. If you have really good eyes, you can see this is Secretary Kerry, my former boss. This is EPA Administrator, now Domestic Climate Czar, Gina McCarthy. Below that picture is the current Secretary of Energy, my former colleague at the Goldman School at Berkeley, Jennifer Granholm. And here in the upper right is one of, I think, the true national treasures. This is Erica Mackey, the president of Grid Alternatives, a social justice clean energy group based in Oakland, California. And at this meeting, Erica Mackey was, in fact, speaking to this national panel. So for Ingra's question, disposing of solar panels is a non-issue today. I, for example, replaced my solar panels, not because they weren't working, but because such more efficient ones were out there. And the company that I used to install them was able to sell my solar panels on the secondhand market. They are quite easy to disassemble, just like if our electronic waste is not dumped, but is taken to our recycling centers, they can easily be taken apart. Martha's question is absolutely right. The smoke from our forest fires, our new human or anthropogenic fifth season, right? There's winter, summer, spring, fall, and now the fire season, huge health and ecological impacts, and in particular impacts on low-income people, people most vulnerable. So our justice story needs a great deal more work to move ahead. One example of the justice story, and I won't do the numbers in detail here, is that my laboratory recently worked with Google, and Google has a database of 60 million rooftops. You all might have been sort of uneasy to see the Google cars mapping your neighborhoods, but they also map with drones and airplanes. And so we use that database, that national study of 60 million rooftops, to ask the following pretty straightforward question. Who has solar in the United States and who doesn't? I obviously like to see that California plan of every rooftop has solar gone nationwide. But when you dig in on the numbers, you see something which is pretty scary. And so without doing too much on the methods and the numbers, this is a picture by neighborhood around the country, and neighborhoods vary from urban areas to rural areas. But what we did is we combined that rooftop data with data from the census on income and of the racial majority, community by community across the country. And by community, I don't mean, you know, whether you're in Millbrae or Montclair, Oakland, or wherever else. What I mean is by the census tract, and that's usually several block areas. When you look at those communities, our metric was if the community is more than 51% of one given racial group, we were going to assign that to a majority ethnicity. When you look at communities with no clear majority, you can see that line is pretty flat. Over from families below the poverty line, for a family of 4 in the United States, the poverty line is $26,500 a year. So you go up an order of magnitude to people earning almost $250,000. You can see there's kind of less, the error bars get wider here for high income and low income. But when you also include communities that have an ethnic majority, you get a really scary picture. If you look at Caucasian majority communities, they are almost 50% more likely to have solar than other communities. And if you look at communities that are majority Hispanic, you see they're about 50% less likely to have solar than those no majority communities. The data for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities on here, it's not statistically significant. There weren't enough that were majority, but you can see what the data is like. And if you look at African American majority neighborhoods, you can see they start out about the same as Hispanic, about 50% less likely, but they go to almost 80% less likely for the high income. And so what you see is that there is a huge disparity. And so we have a real range in here. We have an environmental injustice in who gets solar. This is due to a range of features. It's due to where the first communities where solar was installed, and the most likely feature to document who has solar is your next door neighbor. And so if your next door neighbor does or doesn't, you're more likely to have it or not. And this really highlights a whole range of things. And I'm just looking at Marilee and Trisha's comments in here. Yeah, you can reduce the output of a solar panel quite dramatically by having it soot covered. So our fire season is challenging for our clean energy. And so all of this goes together, and of course the damages are compounded in communities of color. So it's a real challenge. So these are the kinds of things that go into what I would call the data science side of clean energy. When we came out with this report, it got a lot of press for a variety of reasons. And in fact, now there is a piece of the current infrastructure bill that's being debated today in Congress that would actually put money into community level installations of solar in underserved communities, including Native American communities. The Navajo or the Diné Nation are a leader in trying to get solar. That's the largest community in the United States of people who do not have grid tied energy, but we have many low-income communities where the infrastructure was never built to accommodate solar or electric vehicles because of systemic racism, discrimination going on in those communities. So there is a really important nexus here. And this plays out not only domestically in the United States, but it's also critical in terms of the climate dialogue. The meeting in Glasgow is likely to be dominated by two things. One is by the rise of clear measures to look at discrimination, who gets clean energy, who is being kept literally in the dark, and also by the commitment to funding, the kind of things being debated today in DC. And obviously, if the president can get his bill through right now, it will really up the stature of this argument in front of the international community that we really are a country that is pushing for it. And I want to give you an example of what kind of things that means. This is just a snapshot of new faculty hired in the last year at UC Berkeley. Not overall, we hire about 200 new faculty a year, but this is something I'm very proud to have been part of. This is a cluster hire of faculty, specifically people working on environmental race and justice. And this group of young scholars brought in all at the same time to Berkeley is kind of a testament to how, if you really go out and look, you find remarkable scholars who are working on environmental justice and race, and themselves have very different origin stories to tell than kind of many old style academics, kind of an elite community in many places. This really speaks to me to the way in which we can change our scholarship, change our engaged activities to support these kinds of critical mission statements going forward. If you think that this is just kind of a California level push to diversify our teaching, the faces of scholars, the face of engagement with meetings like the climate conference in Glasgow, here's something that President Biden did January 20th in his early flurry of executive orders. What he said is that all federal offices now need to do a special new kind of accounting when we look at the cost of energy or infrastructure projects or investments in agriculture. We don't just do the bottom line math, do the cost benefit analysis, but we take directly from the academic community something that's been worked on very hard over the last 10 years, and that is to develop a new metric. That metric is called the social cost of carbon. This is different than the market price of carbon. In California, we have a market, a cap and trade market. There are proponents who love cap and trade. There are people who hate cap and trade. Some people want to see a cap and dividend or a carbon tax or various things. We happen in California to have a cap and trade system. The price of carbon in California's market is about $20 a ton. That's higher than the price of carbon in Europe, in their Europe Union-wide emissions trading scheme. And China, which has delayed, very sadly, twice the launch of their carbon market, is likely to announce that has gone into national effect at the COP26 meeting. Their opening price will actually be almost exactly what it is in California, $20 a ton. President Biden said, I'm going to require all federal agencies to do this. In my opinion, this is a brilliant move, because what it does is it means that federal offices are now going to do the math, as Bill McKibben would say, and look at the price of carbon and use it in their analyses. And by all the federal offices from all of the places that contract with the federal government to federal agencies, what that means is that organizations doing business with the federal government, every state, will effectively be having a shadow price of carbon, having this analysis in the background to assist them in thinking through the efforts to bring in the social cost. And by social cost, we mean the cost that includes the damage to communities of color and the cost to ecosystems. So it's a remarkable step forward. Thankfully, the team going to Glasgow, myself included, will be armed not just by this federal action and by places like California, but now 11 other states have all set clean energy standards very similar to ours. They're in different levels of passage. New York and California are the two most aggressive, but Washington State and New Mexico and others are all looking at these targets. And so we have well over 50% of the US economy in states that are now devoted to these clean energy before 2050 kinds of goals. And they kind of answer some of the questions that's being asked here by Mark around Tesla and their so-called power wall, getting homes to install storage as well as solar. My home is one of those. I installed, not Tesla, I used a different company, a company called Enphase, based in Petaluma. I installed their battery system. So we have an electric vehicle in the garage, we have solar panels on the roof, and we have the stationary battery. And we now run our home all night on our battery. We discharge it at night. We charge it up during the day when there's that excess power. So instead of exporting, we put it back into our stationary battery, and then we use that to both charge up our electric vehicle, and we give power back to the utility. And we're hoping sometime in the future, the law will be changed so that we can actually sell it back. And there is a difference, as Trish asks, about a renewable and a clean energy standard. Renewables specifically means solar, wind, biofuels, if sustainable, geothermal power, and clean energy is a standard that does include, controversially, nuclear, because the plants themselves do not have high emissions, even if the emissions from mining and other issues and waste and risk issues are part of that story. And so we do charge our electric vehicle and our battery system during the day, and we draw it down at night. Yes, it is part of that kind of mix and picture. And it's something that many of the countries going to the COP meeting are arguing for, so-called energy storage standards. Germany now has one. Denmark is debating one. Morocco has one in place, although only for the largest customers. So there is an interesting movement towards what's called baseload or 24/7 renewables. And that means renewable energy backed up by energy storage. So if we look at the economics of this story today, this is why I think that we can meet these targets much earlier on. So I've mentioned some of the price numbers, but here's a map of the US, not one run by my laboratory, one run by the University of Texas at Austin. And what you see on the colors in this map are what's the least cost form of energy today. Natural gas is in this rust color. Wind is in green, nuclear, although they don't include the end-of-life processing cost, which is a pretty big component here in Wisconsin. And solar is the mauve in parts of the country, but dominated in the Southwest. And if you look really closely in our Bay Area here, this is with no price on carbon. But I mentioned the price on carbon is $20 in California. It's about $8 in New England, and the rest of the country doesn't have a price. So let's plug in the California price. $20 a ton. And you see the map has changed. Essentially, gas has lost out to solar. But I mentioned the social cost of carbon. That is somewhere between 50 and 100. If I plug that number in, what you see is a country transformed. Solar and wind dominate the generation costs, backed up by storage. There's a tiny bit in the Pacific Northwest where gas would remain. There's that little nuclear piece here. And I highlight this as we move into kind of the Q&A discussion part of the session, because Bloomberg News just announced last month that for all of the United States, for many other countries, it is now cheaper to build new solar and wind than to simply operate existing fossil fuel plants. Now you need to add about 10% cost if you also want to add energy storage, and energy storage is ramping up dramatically from lithium-ion batteries, what's in Teslas and other vehicles, to batteries with using very sustainable materials. There is a push to thinking about not only the supply of so-called rare earth elements needed for energy storage, but also the human rights issues. Many of the places where we get lithium and cobalt, like some of the conflict regions of the Congo, there are absolute human rights abuses going on in some of this. We just had an announcement, for example, that a new process was developed that says extraction of lithium from seawater is cheaper than any existing mining operation. So there is just a huge range of opportunities we can do at home at low cost, at high social benefit value, as we think through the ways to make this kind of clean energy transition appear. So I did say I was going to stop at 11:15. I am 2 minutes over. I am going to return screen to see everybody. And we might use some of these slides going forward, but I want to stop here. I've been trying to keep up a little bit with the questions, and let me give people kind of 10 seconds, 20 seconds to catch their breath. And then we'll jump in and use our remaining 13 minutes to answer questions. And I'll start with Doug Mandel's question, and then go to whatever else just jumps into the queue. So feel free to add things in. Again, I'll pause for a second, take a sip, and jump in just a few seconds from now in terms of kind of jumping into the questions. Okay, let me jump in on Doug's and feel free to add more. Again, I'll try to hop in on them. So Doug raises a really neat question, and this is something which is called vehicle to grid, or V to G. And as we build out more batteries in garages like mine, or in the garage of a project I'm working on in the Fruitvale section of Oakland to install a community level battery that can power all the homes in the neighborhood, we also have an interesting situation that the battery that I installed in my garage is a 13 kilowatt hour battery. That's all I needed to power my home for a couple of days. But the battery in my electric vehicle is 60 kilowatt hours, which means the battery I'm driving around with is almost 5 times bigger than the battery I installed in my home. That suggests that you might not even need that stationary battery. After all, like most Americans who drive less than 40 miles a day, and often much less, much of that battery capacity in my car is going to waste. I mean, it's there for when I want to do a longer electric trip, but we're not using it all the time. So I could simply run my house off the battery. I could drive to work here at UC Berkeley and plug back into the grid and provide power back in. And for those of you who saw when President Biden drove the Ford Lightning, the F-150 electric truck, it has 2 modes. One is it's an electric vehicle, but there's another version that you can buy. It's a little more expensive, but that's a version that you simply run your home off of it. And after President Biden drove that car, they had almost 100,000 pre-booked orders to buy that 150 truck overnight. And now Secretary Granholm is doing the same kind of tours. So that is a vehicle to grid opportunity. And it absolutely opens up the door to think about us all as so-called prosumers. We're a producer or a consumer. And it's not just the solar panels on our rooftop. It's all of these options to use energy storage. I recently put a very small $100 down payment down on an electric vehicle from a new company called Aptera. In 2 years, they plan to start selling their very small electric vehicle that you never plug in. It has a solar skin It is a light commuting car, and it is one that you can charge up if you want, but running it on a sunny day, you can essentially run it semi-indefinitely by recharging with a fast coupling between the battery that's built under the seats and the solar skin on it. And so Aptera is an interesting one. I was delighted to jump in and be one of those kind of early investors. Michael asked a question about Moss Landing, and Moss Landing is an absolutely wonderful story. I mean, it was a fossil fuel power plant, but they saw the writing on the wall and they closed the fossil plant, and they opened a electric vehicle. They opened an energy storage facility. Now it's called the Moss Landing Energy Storage Park. They have enough energy to run just about 5% of California's average demand from that one plant. Now, they did have a fire. They had a shutdown event at the plant. They are now back and open, but this is kind of part of the learning curve of learning about how to use these technologies. But it's a really example of shifting our system so that we have so-called baseload renewables. You've got direct energy generation, but you also have these big storage facilities, and that kind of is a balance to my small scale storage facility. So absolutely. Let me jump to Dave's question about will gasoline powered vehicles ever be prohibited? I suspect they probably will, but because there are very strong feelings on this, most of the efforts going this direction are looking at not forbidding the operation of gas-powered vehicles, but banning the sale of new gas-powered vehicles. And this is largely a nod to many rural areas, farms, heavy equipment that may not be quick to convert over. It's very much like when we phased out lead in gasoline. We could still operate lead, the vehicles that required it. You couldn't buy new ones. But there are kind of the substitution process. And if you get new vehicles off of gasoline onto electricity or hydrogen, Ruth brings up DME, dimethyl ether. It is a potential fuel. I'll be surprised if this particular molecule wins out over the benefits of electricity or hydrogen. And part of that is because hydrogen is kind of a remarkable storage opportunity, and it speaks to something I haven't highlighted much yet, and that is that Europe and China have moved ahead very aggressively with offshore wind. China plans to install between now and 2030 enough offshore wind to power California twice over, 60 gigawatts, same thing as in Europe. They also have a 60 gigawatt goal for 2030. But California has no offshore wind. The US only has one offshore wind farm right now, but California wants to go to 10 gigawatts by 2030. New York State wants to do the same thing. Delaware wants the same thing, 10 gigawatts each. And I'm personally working with a number of colleagues to try to get Texas and the Gulf of Mexico to think about these kinds of targets as well. Someone's asked for the website of my laboratory. I've just put it in the chat. And someone asked about fusion, and for that, I just happen to have a slide. So I should pay off Kathleen with a little side payment. I'm going to go back to the slides briefly because I just can't resist talking about fusion. I'm going to, for time, probably not get much into fission. New fission plants are illegal in California, but two recent announcements are really worth noting. The picture on the left is a picture of the so-called NIF facility, the National Ignition Facility. It's out in Livermore. It's 196 high-powered lasers, all focused on a small pellet-sized target. This is a massive building. It's the third biggest building in the United States after the Pentagon and after a research facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But they focus the lasers. It's a $3.5 billion facility. They had a remarkable event. People used to joke that nuclear fusion was 30 to 40 years away, and it's been so for the past 30 or 40 years. Well, that is no longer true. At the Livermore facility, they did a firing of their system 3 weeks ago, where they put in 1.6 megajoules of energy. That probably doesn't mean much as a number. It's a lot of energy. And they got out 1.3 megajoules of energy. So they are 70% of the way to break even. And this was unexpected. Many people thought they wouldn't get to this 70% benchmark until perhaps 2030. Now they're looking at fusion that is net energy generating at this one very big research facility by 2025 or so. And that's not the only piece of big news on fusion. Of course, the fuel for fusion is water. So we have a very large supply, and there is no radioactive waste material the way we have waste radioactive material from our uranium fission plants. There is radioactive hardware. Some of the metals in the core area get so-called tritium loading, where they will shed off some of that, but this is a very much easier thing to manage. We don't have decades or thousands of years of radioactivity. It is essentially short-term radioactive parts. And the facility on the right, this donut-shaped thing, or the D, I like to think, the D on its side, this is the Commonwealth fusion reactor at MIT that just 3 weeks ago had a equally or maybe even a more remarkable announcement. This is one ring of a torus. So if you turn your head on the side and look into this donut, this is like one slice of a wheel going around. This fusion ring system works. So MIT, perhaps a decade ahead of schedule, has now gotten their fusion plant to have every single component working. They now have set themselves a 2024 deadline to build the full-scale version and have an operating fusion plant. And this would mean we bring on another remarkable source. And if it's not just these two, there are more than 10 different quite intriguing fusion companies working. So there is an interesting mix out there. Ruth asked about thorium. Thorium is an intriguing fuel. Instead of uranium, you can run many typical fission reactors. We're talking fusion then, we're talking fission now, where you break apart heavy atoms. Thorium is interesting because there's a lot of thorium in the world. It's concentrated in India and the United States. The upside of thorium is that you cannot make nuclear weapons out of it. The downside of thorium, however, is that it's no easier to manage than uranium in terms of the type of nuclear plants. Given what I've just said about fusion, I'll be surprised if anyone really devotes the money and effort to making thorium reactors, although there are a few companies looking at mixed uranium thorium machines. So we'll see, but I am not one that's holding my breath. And Marilee asked about the Bitcoin question. So why is Bitcoin so dirty? And why is the discussions of Elon Musk and others about investing or letting you pay for your Tesla with Bitcoin so problematic? Well, it turns out, if any of you who want to hear a father-daughter podcast, my older daughter, Sade, and I have a podcast called Intergenerational. The episode going up this week, if you just Google my name and Intergenerational, you'll find it, was all about the Tesla investments. And the reason why Bitcoin is seen as so dirty is because the way that these cryptocurrencies work is that you're essentially continually doing calculations to maintain the security, the blockchain key from one to another. And so one of the real issues is that Bitcoin is incredibly energy intensive. Now, in a world with lots and lots of solar, that might not be a problem. And since we're moving towards that world, the carbon footprint of Bitcoin goes down. But right now, many of the places that have invested in this, we have some offshore holding companies. I won't use their other names. We have some efforts to build out Bitcoin repositories around the world. And we are finding a great deal of coal and natural gas has been highlighted in some of the places. So Bitcoin right now has a very high carbon footprint, and we'll see where it goes over time. So Sarah asked about the toxic issues of radioactive waste from fusion, and I tried to highlight that with the tritium question. There is some tritium irradiation that comes from some of the core metals you saw in that big fusion reactor, but this has a half-life of just literally weeks. So there is not much toxic material at all. It's particularly easy to manage this compared to the junkyards full of radioactive material we have sitting at many of the US reactors. And while this sits largely in big swimming pools called spent fuel pools, we have much poorer quality management if we look at nuclear reactors in the former Soviet Union, in Soviet Union. We're worried about those materials. And so the switch from fission to fusion, if this all pans out, is really a remarkable process. Marilee asked a question about solar. Let me jump on that. I know we're right at time. I'll do 10 seconds only, and then we'll end. Solar panels are already very efficient. They're more than 25% efficient. The theoretical upper limit is about 50% efficient, but really the efficiency is not the issue. The real issue is what's the cost, and solar is now the least cost form of energy around the world for many new plants. And so I am going to jump off. I'm going to thank you all. Susan, thanks for letting me run a minute or two long. I want to thank everyone. And again, if you go to that Twitter feed I mentioned, Dan_Kammen, you can get some of the comments and we can kind of go from there. If you want to engage further, happy to chat. Thank you always letting me come back to.
Yeah, thank you. And it was good to see that your energy source is Pete's coffee.
It is indeed. Thanks so much. All right, I want to thank everybody.
Yeah.
And Susan will manage the recording stuff, but thank you all.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks a lot, Dan. I do want to mention to everybody who's here that the recording of Dan's talk will be available probably within a week to 10 days. We will have it captioned and posted on YouTube. All of you will be notified that it is available. October Fridays are completely devoted to climate change issues. And obviously we started with Dan, of course, for good reason. Next week, October 8th, we have our colleague Bree Rosenblum, who's an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management here at Berkeley. She will be talking about biodiversity conservation. It's called Finding Hope for Biodiversity Conservation in an Era of Rapid Global Change. We hope you will join us, and thank you for joining us today. All the best.